All right, it's 3 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Happy Friday. We've made it through another week. I think we've got, 4 more weeks after this or so until maybe 5. No, 4. Until Thanksgiving break. So we're making progress, right? We can see the finish line. It's not too far away, but we've still got some work to do. So today, we're going to conclude our study of Judaism. We're going to go through the 5th and final lecture, and this lecture is about modern Judaism, or Judaism and modernity. And at the end of today's lecture, you're going to have a homework assignment. And this is an online homework assignment. You can find it on the Moodle class website. It is labeled as Judaism Homework, or Judaism HW, and it's right there on the main Moodle class website. And there you will find a range of questions about Judaism. Right? So we spent the last 5 classes, including today, studying Judaism. And on Monday, we're going to start to study Christianity. And we're going to spend 5 classes on Christianity. So since we still have so much time left until the next exam, I'm assigning this additional homework assignment to reinforce what we've learned about Judaism before we move on to our study of Christianity, okay? So that assignment will be due by the start of class on Monday. So 3 o'clock p.m. on Monday. It's worth 5 points. Don't forget to do that assignment, okay? So with that said, when we last met, we discussed the Jewish diaspora, and I believe I can take my mask off because I am alone in the classroom once again. So if someone shows up, I will put it back on, but for now, I will remove it. In my last lecture, I talked about the Jewish diaspora. So we learned about the migration of Jewish communities throughout initially the Middle East and Mediterranean world. And over time, those migrations will extend even further to places like the United States once we get to the modern era. And that'll be one of my topics in today's lecture. However, in talking about the communities that took shape around the Mediterranean, we talked about the existence of 2 distinctive geographical, cultural groups. We talked about the Ashkenazim, which refers to the Jews who settled in Christian-majority Europe, and we talked about the Sephardim, which are the Jews who settled what would eventually become Muslim-majority North Africa, and all the way into the Middle East. And when we talk about the Jewish diaspora in the Middle East, we have this other term, Mizrahi, referring to the Eastern Jews. And what I did is I grouped the Mizrahi in with the Sephardim to sort of simplify it for us. So we're talking about the Ashkenazim or Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardim or Sephardic Jews. Well, today we're going to be talking a lot about the Ashkenazi Jews, the Jews who settled in Europe, and the impact that developments in Europe in the modern period had on the development of Judaism. So let's begin by talking about the impact of the European Enlightenment on European Jewish thought. We know from previous lectures that in the 18th century, we have this radical paradigm shift in European culture, thought, politics, known as the European Enlightenment. And the European Enlightenment ushered in a new age of reason, of free inquiry, of scientific exploration, changes in so many aspects of life, one being the separation of religion from politics, the emergence of secularism, and the partition of religion from the public sphere, from the realm of government, law, and so forth. And while this is going on, we also are witnessing the decline of the once great empires, that the prevailing political unit that will come to dominate Europe and other parts of the world over the 19th and the 20th centuries is the emergence of the nation state. And the nation state is based on the idea of imagined communities that we think of as nations. That is groups of people who form a common identity based on a shared history, a shared culture, which may include religion, and a shared language. This idea that these diverse individuals are all part of a single nation. and that as a nation, they should govern themselves and have their own state. And so in the modern period, we see the emergence of nation states based on this idea of nationalism. And so when we look at the map of Europe, we begin to see the emergence of, French state for people who are French, the German state, and so on, right? And so people begin to think about themselves in these terms, and not simply along, let's say, a tribal identity or a religious identity, but instead as being part of a particular nation. Well, all these diverse developments that are rooted in the European Enlightenment and continue to develop over the 19th and 20th century have an impact on the Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews who are living in Europe in the diaspora period. And they begin to think about Jewish identity and the practice of Judaism as a religion in modern times. So for example, here's a dilemma. If we're seeing the rise of a new secular, nationalistic political paradigm, the idea that, for example, France is to be a country for all people who live within France, who speak French, and it shouldn't matter whether they're Catholic or Protestant or a non-believer or Jewish, they will all have equal rights as French citizens, right? You can understand how that would be very appealing if you're a member of a religious or ethnic minority. Well, along with that idea, some Jewish thinkers are wondering whether Jewish communities in Europe should begin to assimilate and adapt to the non-Jewish societies around them to fully integrate into those broader societies in the modern era. So for example, instead of having separate Jewish schooling and separate ways of doing things, for example, maybe speaking Yiddish instead of French as the first language, that Jews should conform to the prevailing social cultural norms of societies in which they live, even though they're predominantly non-Jewish. Others, however, rejected that idea and believed that no, it's important for us to maintain our distinctive identity, our own traditions, our own history, our own ways of doing things. And so we see these debates and these conflicts occurring within the modern Jewish community, particularly in Europe among the Ashkenazim. So this develops into a movement known as the Haskalah, which is sometimes described as the Jewish Enlightenment, of Jewish thinkers grappling with the ideas of the European Enlightenment and figuring out what does it mean to be Jewish in modern times, more specifically in modern Europe. What should be the level of Jewish involvement in the outer culture, the broader culture going forward? And this movement is also drawing from, of course, the latest developments in political theory and philosophy, and also academic study of religion, all the sort of modern scientific discoveries going on. And this results in new forms of Judaism. That out of this period of modernization, we will see the emergence of three main forms of modern Judaism. Now, if we want to get really specific, there's more than three, but these are the three main camps, and thus we're going to talk about them for the sake of this world religions class. The first of these three main camps is Reform Judaism. So Reform Judaism represents those Jews who believe that it was necessary to reform and modernize Judaism to fully assimilate and become integrated within the broader modern cultures, nation states in which Jews were living. So that meant totally engaging the outside world, right? Not remaining insular, but engaging in, for example, you send your kids to public schools where they learn all of the latest science and biology and so forth, evolution, all that knowledge, instead of keeping them in a traditional educational system where you might focus on the study of the Talmud, right? Instead, you're engaging in all the modern secular knowledge that's out there as well. And this resulted in a lot of changes to Jewish practice and belief. So in Reform Judaism, worship services began to adopt the language of the country, the vernacular spoken language. So in the United States, that would mean that if you go to a synagogue service, then it would be performed in English rather than in classical Hebrew. If you're living in France, that means that the service, the liturgy, would be in French, right? So they adopt the vernacular to replace the traditional Hebrew. They also began to incorporate elements of modern culture, the culture that surrounded them. So we see, for example, Reform communities, including things like pipe organs, to go along with the worship service. Now, pipe organs had not been a part of traditional Jewish worship services, but they were something that you would have seen in churches at this time, right? So you can see the cultural influence going on. The worship services in the synagogue were also shortened, making them more convenient, more suitable for the hustle and bustle of modern life, where people have places to be and so many things to take care of. In modern times, we see some challenges to patriarchal social norms. And we know that according to Jewish tradition, that in a synagogue, men and women would be separated from each other, and that men enjoyed certain roles and privileges that were not afforded to women. This is not unique to Judaism. We've seen it many times in other religious traditions and in any cultures, but in modern times, people are starting to challenge those traditions and think about principles of equality, all right, a greater gender equality, giving women, for example, the right to vote. 19th Amendment and the Constitution is passed in 1920, right? Before that, you didn't have universal suffrage. Women couldn't vote. So these are all broader things going on in the world in the modern period. So Reform Jews begin to make changes in their practice of Judaism as well. In a Reform synagogue, they do away with the separation of men and women. In a Reform synagogue, men and women sit together. They also begin to reevaluate the exclusion of women from the ranks of the rabbis. And it's Reform Judaism that is the first branch or denomination of Judaism to fully accept the ordination of women as rabbis. And this is something that begins in 1972. So now in Reform Judaism, you have both male and female rabbis. And if women can be the rabbis, that means that they can also be the interpreters of Halakha, or Jewish law. They also introduced the ritual observance of a bat mitzvah. So previously in Judaism, when a Jewish boy becomes 13 years old, he goes through a ritual ceremony that marks as a rite of passage his transition into adulthood, that he is now a man according to Jewish law, and thus he has to follow all the different mitzvot, the different commandments. So whereas before he wouldn't have to do, for example, the daily prayers, but now that he's an adult in the eyes of Jewish law at 13, he has to do those things. And so he's referred to as a bar mitzvah, which means son of the commandment. But that ritual ceremony wasn't traditionally done for girls. A girl, according to traditional Jewish thought, becomes a woman at the age of 12. So she would be a bat mitzvah, a daughter of the commandment, but there wasn't a ritual ceremony in which the girl would read a Torah portion the same way there was for boys. So Reform Judaism introduced this ritual commemoration, a bat mitzvah, in which the girls went through the same rite of passage that the boys went through. So we see multiple changes of greater gender equality in Reform Judaism. So how do you justify these types of changes? Well, one has to do, on one hand, it's about the broader cultural influence, but it's also about a new understanding of the sacred text. The traditional view is that the Torah, for example, was the divine, perfect word of God, of Hashem, Yahweh, to the prophet Moses, and it is eternally binding on the Jewish people in every context for all time until the day of resurrection. But in light of modern academic study of the Bible and new understandings about how the Bible came to be, Reform Jews came to view the sacred text, like the Torah, as being a kind of repository of Jewish tradition, of sacred narratives, but reflecting the human authors who wrote it in their own circumstances, in their own times. And thus, while the principles and the morality of the text still apply, the literal meanings are not eternally valid for all peoples in all times. So with that in mind, Reform thinkers rejected many of the traditional mitzvot that the rabbis had been observing for centuries. So, for example, in Reform Judaism, it's not necessary to keep kashrut, to keep Jewish dietary law. It's not necessary to observe all the rules regarding purity, such as visiting a mikveh to purify your body before praying or touching the Torah again. Now, on an individual level, if you're a member of a Reform congregation, you as an individual can choose to observe these things. That's fine. It's up to you as an individual, but it's not obligatory. So in Reform Judaism, it's not considered a sin if, for example, a Jewish person eats a meal where meat and dairy are mixed, right? That would be a violation of kashrut, of dietary law. But in Reform Judaism, that no longer really matters. The same is true with Reform observance of the Sabbath, that all of the strict rules about what constitutes work and what has to be avoided no longer applies in Reform Judaism either. And thus, to be a member of a modern nation state and participate in society is largely unencumbered by the Sabbath, whereas that would not be the case in traditional, what's now called Orthodox Judaism. So where do we find Reform Judaism as the dominant form? Right here in the United States of America. So of all the denominations in modern Judaism, Reform Judaism is the biggest here in the United States, and we have some major institutions of Reform Judaism. So if you want to train to be a rabbi in the Reform Judaism tradition, then you could go to, for example, Hebrew Union College, which is located here in the United States. And it's a very influential movement within American Judaism. And I'll be talking more about Judaism in America later on in the lecture. So if Reform Judaism represents the ideas of the modernizers coming out of the Haskalah, right, the Jewish Enlightenment in Europe, what about their opponents, those who rejected the reforms of the modernizers? Well, that comes to be known as Orthodox Judaism. Now, until you have Reform Judaism, there's really no need to refer to something as Orthodox Judaism. You just had Judaism as it was, traditional rabbinic Judaism. But once you have this new form of rabbinic Judaism, this liberal progressive form, Reform Judaism, then we have a new designation to refer to the earlier form that continues to exist. And so we call that Orthodox Judaism. So Orthodox Judaism is the faction that continues to defend Jewish tradition, the old way of doing things, the status quo, as it were, rejects the changes that the modernizers brought about as illegitimate, and continues to adhere to traditional halakha, Jewish laws formulated by the rabbis over the centuries. So things like the purity laws and the dietary law, how you dress, that men should cover their hair with the yarmulke or the kippah, and women likewise wearing a tishel or a shadel, and so forth. That the Torah is the literal word of Hashem, given to Moses at Sinai, eternally binding for the Jewish people for all times, and only men can be rabbis. Now, there have been a couple movements to try and introduce female rabbinic ordination into Orthodox Judaism, but it hasn't taken root. So in Orthodoxy, only men can be rabbis. In Reform, men and women can be rabbis. In the synagogue, you still find the traditional gender segregation of the women's and the men sitting separately, the use of a mechitza or a balcony to separate the women from the men. A bar mitzvah only happens for boys entering into adulthood. Now, the bat mitzvah ceremony for girls has become very popular. And so in some cases, you might see individual, otherwise Orthodox families holding a bat mitzvah for the daughter. But in terms of what is official Orthodox Jewish policy, the bat mitzvah is not a part of that tradition. That's a product of the modernizers. And also the modernizers, by the way, in Reform Judaism, in Orthodoxy, a girl becomes a bat mitzvah, that she's a woman at the age of 12, but a boy at 13, he becomes a man. So Reform Judaism moved the age for girls up. So it's 13 for girls in Reform Judaism, but it's 12 in Orthodoxy. Right? So in Reform, they made it the same as the boys. Men and women, as I said, will still cover their head, and still you have the strict observance of the Sabbath, right? Abstaining from all forms of work, which can include things even like, using a light switch or tying a knot and things like that, all depending on what the rabbis define as work. Here you can see an image of an Orthodox synagogue where you have the old gender segregation barriers in place. This is the mechitza, the screen. This is the women's section. On the other side, you have the men's section up by the ark and the bima. Here we have a balcony being used with curtains. So this is the women's section and the men's section down below. And then there's a third group we have to talk about. So if Reform Judaism, rooted in the ideas of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment in Europe in the 19th century, represents the modernizers, the reformers, the liberal progressive branch of modern Judaism, and Orthodoxy represents the defenders of tradition, of maintaining the status quo. There's a third group that represents a middle ground between these two positions. That there were other Jewish thinkers who believed that Judaism needed to adapt to modern times, but they believed that Reform Judaism went too far. They were too zealous in trying to assimilate into the non-Jewish cultures in which they lived, and so they went too far in their changes and in their reforms. But they believed that Orthodoxy still was too stuck in the past and needed to adapt. So this becomes what's called conservative Judaism, which, despite the name, is not the most conservative form. It's actually the middle ground. Orthodoxy would be the most conservative in the sense of maintaining the old ways of doing things. So conservative Judaism represents the middle ground. As I said, they are open to the idea of reforming Judaism for modern times, but they believed that those changes needed to be far more gradual, that there had to be very careful, systematic analysis of all of these issues, such as the ordination of women as rabbis. Now, in Reform Judaism, that change didn't come overnight. It didn't happen until the 1970s. So even they were sort of cautious there, but conservative Judaism, again, is open to some of those changes, and sometimes Reform Judaism will lead the way and then conservative will follow years later, but that it needs to be done far more judiciously with a lot of consultation and discussion. So here we can still find Hebrew being used in worship service, observance of various mitzvot, albeit not to the level that you would find in Orthodox Judaism, an openness towards academic secular study of the Bible, but also a continuing recognition that the Bible is divinely inspired by God to the prophets, and thus its content still being relevant to our times and our circumstances. Initially, conservative Judaism did not accept the ordination of women, but following the reformers years later, they began to ordain women as rabbis too in 1985. So what we have then, among the three branches of modern Judaism that we're talking about, we have female ordination in Reform and in conservative, but not in Orthodoxy. Okay? Now, like Reform Judaism, the center of conservative Judaism is here in the United States. The United States, which has the second largest Jewish population in the world, is the headquarters of both Reform Judaism and conservative Judaism. In the state of Israel, which we'll be talking about in the lecture later today, Orthodoxy is dominant. So you will find Reform and conservative there as well, but Orthodoxy is the dominant form of Judaism in the state of Israel. This is JTS, or the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's one of the preeminent Jewish seminaries where people go to train to be rabbis in the world, and it's affiliated with conservative Judaism. So this is sort of the citadel of conservative Judaism, and it initially was an Orthodox institution established to sort of fend off or respond to the modernizers who created Reform Judaism, but in time it fell in line with conservative Judaism instead. And so it's the most important institute of learning for conservative Judaism in the world. And it's located in New York City. There's also a branch of Hebrew Union College in New York City, which is the primary center for Reform Judaism. So that's a nice segue for us to talk about Judaism in the United States. So the American Jewish community is the second largest in the world after the community in the state of Israel. And the majority of the American Jewish community is of Ashkenazi origin. There are those of Sephardic, Mizrahi, Yemenite, Ethiopian origin as well as converts to Judaism, but the majority come from various parts of Europe, such as immigrants from Russia or Ukraine, Poland, Germany, France, Britain. And we find the largest concentration of Jews in the United States around the greater New York City metropolitan area. Within the city of New York itself, there's something like 300,000 members of the Hasidic community. And so that's just the Hasidic community, let alone the Reform, the secular, and so forth as well. An interesting local bit of information is that way back in the year 1800, when our republic was still in its relative infancy, the largest Jewish community in the United States was in South Carolina, mainly centered around the city of Charleston. And that community, interestingly enough, was largely Sephardic in origin rather than Ashkenazi. Now, that community was really small, but relative to the number of Jews elsewhere in the United States in the year 1800, it was the largest. Now, today, the state of South Carolina has a relatively small Jewish community. There are a variety of synagogues. I mean, so for example, just in the Myrtle Beach area here, there's something like 5 or 6 different synagogues affiliated with different denominations or branches of Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Hasidic, right? I showed you an image of Chabad in Myrtle Beach in the last lecture. But yeah, way back in 1800, South Carolina had the largest. Now, American Jews have made enormous contributions to American culture, and history, and here's just one example of this. This is the cover of a Time magazine issue from 1999 or 2000, and it shows you the 2 members of the presidential ticket for the Democratic Party in the 2000 election. And we have the presidential nominee, Al Gore, and the vice presidential nominee is Senator Joseph Lieberman from Connecticut. And Joseph Lieberman came from a modern Orthodox family. And if they had won, then Joseph Lieberman would have been the first Jewish vice president in American history. And thus far, there has been neither a vice president or a president of the United States who has been Jewish, but we had a vice presidential nominee who, that was one of the most closely contested elections in American history. You also see the word chutzpah here. This is a Yiddish word, which is entered into American colloquial English as well, which basically means like bravado, right? You've got a lot of chutzpah. So in addition to JTS, I mentioned the presence of Hebrew Union College, which was established in the late 19th century. That's the preeminent institute of Reform Judaism. The original campus was built in Ohio, and you might say, why was it built off in Ohio? Well, back in the 19th century, Ohio was part of the Western frontier. And so land was much cheaper and readily available out there. And so that's where this Institute of Jewish Learning was constructed. But in modern times today, they also have a branch in New York City as well. In 1948, we see the creation of a new nation state, the state of Israel, in what had previously been the British Mandate of Palestine. And with the creation of that state, we have mass migration of Jews from other parts of the world, such as from various European countries, and subsequently from places like Egypt and North Africa. So one might guess that you would see a dramatic decline in the American Jewish population, but that has not occurred. Instead, the United States still has, even with the existence of a Jewish state since 1948, still has a population of over 5 million, the second largest Jewish population in the world. In this map, we can see the regions of the country that have the largest Jewish communities. So here you can see my home state of New York up here. That is dark red, so greater than 6% of the population of the state is Jewish, and we have New Jersey also there. You can see some neighboring states also have some significant populations. Florida, a lot of people from the Northeast, from New York, New Jersey, down there in Florida. South Carolina is in blue, so we're talking a fraction of 1%. And you move over here, you've got Illinois, so places like Chicago, and then over here, Nevada and California. And then you can also see that certain parts of the country really have very, very small Jewish communities. In the upper Midwest here, the Dakotas, and Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and then down here, places like Oklahoma, very, very small Jewish communities. Now, there was a survey done in 2013 of American Jews and their ideas of Jewish identity. So Jewish identity, as I tried to briefly explain in my first lecture, is complex because it's not only a religious identity, but it's also an ethnocultural identity, one based on your ancestry, your heritage. And so it's possible for someone to identify as being Jewish and not practice the religion of Judaism. They might not have any religion at all. They might become, they might be agnostic and very secular, or maybe they practice a religion like Buddhism, right? That they're Jewish by their ancestry and heritage, but practice a religion like Buddhism or something else. Okay, so these questions delved into those issues. If we look over here, we can see a survey questioning whether people identify as with the religion of Judaism or being Jewish but having no religion. And you can see a generational difference, that the older generation much more strongly identified with the religion of Judaism, that was a core part of their identity as Jews. And then the younger generation, we have the millennial generation, those born after 1980, it drops down to only 68% saying they're Jewish by religion. Right? If we go over here, we can look at the responses to the question of being Jewish is mainly a matter of, and the options were ancestry or culture, religion, or a combination of religion and ancestry or culture. And the total numbers were that 62% of those polled for this survey said that being Jewish is mainly a matter of ancestry and culture, not religion. 15% said religion, and 23% said a combination of religion and ancestry and culture. So the American Jewish community, judging by this survey, seems to emphasize ancestry and culture as being more important to being Jewish than actually observing the religion of Judaism. Among those who identify with denominations, with a particular denomination of Judaism, 35% identify with Reform Judaism. So Reform Judaism, according to this poll, is the largest denomination of Judaism in the United States of America. The second largest is Conservative Judaism. That was the middle ground. And then only 10% Orthodox. Now, as I said before, there's actually more than those three. There are various other kinds of varieties, like Reconstructionist Judaism. They would all fall within this other camp of 6%. But we're only really focused in this class on these three wings, and you can see that Reform is the biggest. What's the second largest piece of this pie? It's actually no denomination. So 30% of American Jews surveyed didn't identify with any of those denominations, but 35% identified with Reform. So Reform is the dominant form of Judaism here in the United States. It's not that way in the state of Israel. So let's talk about Israel. How did the state of Israel come to be in 1948? Well, it all started with a political theory among Ashkenazi Jews in 19th century Europe. Despite the promise of secular nationalism, this idea that all citizens of a new nation state would have equal rights regardless as to their religion, it didn't matter whether you were Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or an atheist, an agnostic, whatever it may be, you would all have equal rights, despite the hope and the promise that seemed to hold for Europe's Jewish community. The problem of anti-Semitism persisted. The problem of discrimination and even violence against Jews in Europe persisted. And the reality that anti-Semitism continued had a huge impact on a Hungarian Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl in the 19th century. Now, Theodor Herzl himself came from a very secular family. He wasn't particularly religious in his Judaism. He was part of an Ashkenazi family that had been deeply influenced by the Haskalah and the various modernization campaigns that developed in Europe at that time. And he reported on a court case in France known as the Dreyfus Affair. In this court case, a French military officer who was Jewish was being accused of treason. And for outside observers, the evidence clearly indicated that this officer was innocent. But the judge found him guilty. And the conclusion of the outside observers, which included Herzl, who was reporting on the case, was that this officer was found guilty purely on the basis of the fact that he was Jewish, that this was anti-Semitism, that this officer was being accused of being a kind of enemy of the French state purely on the fact that he was Jewish. despite the fact that the evidence clearly showed that he was innocent. So based on this, Herzl decides that the only way Jews in Europe or elsewhere in the world are going to ultimately be free of persecution, free of injustice, of anti-Semitism, is if Jews have their own state. And so he develops this political ideology known as Zionism. So Zionism you can think of as Jewish nationalism, this idea that Jews, wherever they are a distinctive people apart from everywhere else, and they, like other nation groups, are entitled to their own nation state. And if Jews have their own nation state, they can have their own government, rule themselves, and their own military, and thus be protected from being ruled by non-Jews who continue to persecute and kill them. Right? So now the question is, how do we create this state? Where should it be? Now, Herzl never lived to see the creation of the Jewish state that he envisioned in his writings, such as Der Judenstaat, which is his foundational manifesto calling for the creation of a Jewish state. But at the time, you're beginning to see the collapse of various empires, the rise of European colonial powers, and as history would unfold in the 20th century after Herzl has died, the land of Palestine, which had been a province in the Muslim Ottoman Empire for centuries, and before that, part of various other Muslim empires, the Abbasids, the Mamluk Sultanate, the Umayyad Caliphate, the Rashidun Caliphate, and so on, going back to the 7th century, now came under British colonial rule, just as India had been under British colonial rule. We're entering into the stage of Britain's peak as a colonial power. And those who adopted Herzl's ideas that Jews needed to have their own state saw an opportunity there that now would be the time to encourage immigration from all these different parts of Europe to the British Mandate of Palestine in order to lay the groundwork for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. That is the future state of Israel. Now, the problem is that Palestine was already inhabited by hundreds of thousands of Arabic-speaking Muslims, Christians, and even a small community of Jews as well. And they had lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years, going back as far as records could tell you, and both the British and the Ottoman Empire kept census records of those populations. So we actually know how many people lived in the various towns and cities, including Jerusalem, El Khalil, or Hebron, Jaffa, all these other places throughout Palestine. And so when these immigrants, primarily from Europe, start arriving, and they're coming with the idea that, all right, we're going to create our own state here, not an Arab Jewish state, a state for Jews, this creates conflict with the existing indigenous Arabic population. And at the same time, the ideas of nationalism are also having an impact on the Arabs in the region. So they begin to think of themselves as a nation, as a people, who we know as the Palestinians. And they hope to see that land become, once the British leave, an independent Arab state of Palestine. So now you have two competing ethno-cultural groups who also have different national identities and competing nationalisms. And in the 1930s, we're seeing violence breaking out between the two. There's an Arab revolt against the immigration of Jews from Europe who hope to come and create a state there. Now, Zionism, when it first began, was a largely secular project. Herzl himself had been secular. He wasn't interested in restoring the ancient Jewish monarchy from the house of David and creating a theocracy where the laws of the Torah were the laws of the land. Instead, he was from the modernist camp, and he was deeply influenced by the political models already present in Europe. And so he saw Israel as a secular nation state for the Jews that implemented a parliamentary democracy. Now, obviously, the religion of Judaism would have a special privileged place in that state, but it was not to be a theocracy. And later on, when we talk about Israel today, there are factions in the diverse political spectrum of the state of Israel in the 21st century who are theocrats and want to transform Israel from a secular state into a theocratic state, while others want to maintain the roots of the state as a secular state. So there's this interesting division within the state of Israel today between basically theocrats and secularists about the future of Israel. Here we see a photograph of Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, and this is a cover of his initial manifesto calling for the creation of a Jewish state, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. He never lived to see the creation of Israel. He died in 1904, and he was buried in Europe, but his remains were then later transferred to the state of Israel. So there was opposition to Zionism, of course, from the Arabs, but even within the Jewish community, particularly among religiously observant Jews, there were rabbis who opposed the secular nature of Zionism, but also they believed that it was blasphemous because they had believed that the diaspora would only end when the Mashiach, when the Messiah comes. When the Messiah comes, then the diaspora will end, all the Jews will return to the promised land, and the new messianic era will begin. But here we have this secular movement sort of forcing God's hand. And so there was religious opposition, but that type of opposition within the Jewish community steadily declines in time. And one of the horrific events that further builds support for Zionism, for the creation of a Jewish state, is the Holocaust. So I talked a little bit about the Holocaust in my fourth lecture, but we need to revisit it once again. So in the 1930s, we see the rise of a fascist regime in Germany, the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler. And Hitler and the Nazis are white supremacists. They want to eliminate non-Aryans, non-whites basically from Europe, beginning with Germany, but any land that they conquer as well, like Poland and Austria and so forth, they want to eliminate. So they target people like the Roma, who are often known as gypsies, but their primary target is Jews. They see the Semitic people as being aliens who are not part of European Aryan society, and so they seek to eliminate Jews. And wherever they go, they establish death camps. So on this map, every Nazi flag that you see here is a death camp, a facility established purely for the purpose of systematically killing Jews and other opponents of the Nazis. The result of the Holocaust is the killing of 6 million Jews, overwhelmingly Ashkenazi Jews, because most of the killing is going on in Germany, of Europe, but the Nazis and their allies also get into North Africa as well. And so some Sephardic Jews also are victims of the Holocaust, but it's mainly the Ashkenazi community. And the consequence, once we get to the end of World War II and the Holocaust, is that 60% of Europe's Jewish population is killed. 60%. So in the face of the horrors of the Holocaust and the nature of the violence, I mean, the imagery, the documented atrocities of the Holocaust are so disturbing. The inhumanity of it is so profound that this seemed to, in some ways, support Herzl's argument, right? That even in this modern secular era, that the Jews in Europe or elsewhere were not going to be safe. And so a lot of people then really turn their attention to Zionism and the project of creating a Jewish state. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, when Britain is also exhausted, so it begins to withdraw from its former colonial territory. So we talked about this is the time, Britain withdraws from India in 1947, and that's when the partition of India occurs. We have the creation of Hindu majority India, Muslim majority Pakistan. They also withdraw from Palestine, and they leave the question of the Arabs and the Jews, who have competing visions for the future of Palestine, to the United Nations. So the United Nations decides that they're going to partition Palestine into two states, a Jewish state, Israel, and an Arab state, Palestine, existing side by side with each other. But the Palestinian Arabs reject the partition. At this time, the overwhelming population of Palestine is Arab, not Jewish, and so they see giving about half of the territory to this largely immigrant Jewish minority to be completely unjust. They reject it, and the other Arab nations like Egypt and Syria are on their side, and a war breaks out. And so you have the Arabs, the combined forces of the Arabs, fighting against this small Zionist movement within Palestine, and the Zionists, who would later become the Israelis with the creation of the State of Israel, are victorious. This is celebrated for Israelis, but also non-Israeli Jews, as not only a remarkable political achievement, but some even talk about it in miraculous terms, that this is the independence of the Jewish people, Independence Day. From the Palestinian side, this is the Nakba, this is the catastrophe. This is where they lost Palestine, and as a result of the creation of the State of Israel, which included, of course, open warfare, in some cases, ethnic cleansing, 700,000 Palestinian Muslims and Christians are left homeless and as refugees. And still today in the 21st century, you still have refugees and their descendants, which are even more numerous, living in refugee camps in various parts of the Middle East. And also in time, they migrate elsewhere. Palestinian Christians in particular would leave, and they would use existing church networks to relocate to places like the United States and other countries as well. So once you have the creation of the State of Israel, and here's the front page of the Palestine Post from 1948, the State of Israel is born, then many of the neighboring states where you had Sephardic Jewish communities start treating their Jewish citizens as enemies within. So in a country like Egypt, for example, because they had been at war with this new Jewish state created by Ashkenazi Zionists, they start treating the Sephardic Jews within their countries as enemies. And you see roundups, people being arrested and put in camps. At one time, the city of Cairo had something like 200,000 Jews in it, but today there's about 100. So you see in the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel, now a mass migration of Sephardic Jews leaving countries like Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, other places, migrating to Israel. And today, even though Israel was founded by Ashkenazi Jews, Zionism started in Europe, the population, the Jewish population of Israel today, it's about 80% Jewish, is majority Sephardic Mizrahi, Jews from the Middle East and North Africa rather than from Europe. So here we can see a map of the stages in the development of the creation of the State of Israel. This was the proposed partition plan of the United Nations. And then after the War of Independence, this is what the State of Israel looked like. So this is what Israel looks like according to the international community. But then in 1967, another war broke out between the Israelis and the neighboring Arab states, principally the Syrians and Egyptians. And Israel conquered the Sinai from Egypt and Gaza from Egypt, the West Bank, which had been under Jordanian control since the War of Independence in 48, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Now, according to international law, it's illegal for a country to annex territory it conquered in war. So, for example, it would have been illegal for the United States to claim that Iraq was now part of the United States of America during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, right? That's illegal under international law. So it's illegal for Israel to then just declare that the Sinai is part of Israel or the West Bank is part of Israel. They returned the Sinai to Egypt in a later peace treaty with Anwar Sadat, but Israel continues to maintain control to different degrees of these other territories. So when you hear in the news media people talking about the occupied territories or the occupation, they're not talking about the state of Israel. They're talking about the West Bank or Gaza or the Golan Heights, which were captured by Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967. For religious purposes, and I realize I'm just about out of time, the 67 war brought the old city of Jerusalem under Israeli control. And it's in the old city of Jerusalem, or what's also called East Jerusalem, that you find all the important religious sites. So that's where you'd find, for example, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the most important Christian sites in the entire world. But for Judaism, this is where you find the Western Wall, also called the Wailing Wall, which is believed to be the last remaining segment of the Second Temple, which was destroyed by the Roman Empire in the year 70. We talked about the destruction of the Second Temple in an earlier lecture. So this wall becomes the holiest place on earth in modern Judaism, and it becomes a place of pilgrimage and a place of prayer. And because Orthodoxy is the dominant form of Judaism in Israel, as opposed to the United States, Orthodox ritual protocols control the area around the Western Wall. So you have here a mechitza, so you have a designated men's section and a women's section. And here in this image, you can also see the proximity of the Western Wall to the third holiest site in Islam. So we'll study Islam later. It's the second largest religion in the world. This is the Masjid al-Aqsa complex with the Dome of the Rock shrine built by the Umayyad caliphs in 692, third holiest site in Islam, and it's right next to the Western Wall. So you have these two holy sites from these two religions right on top of each other. It's one of the most contested pieces of real estate in the entire world and the center of a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, and a lot of animosity as well. All right, I'm all out of time. You now have a homework assignment to complete. It's online. It's on the Moodle class website. It's labeled Judaism Homework or Judaism HW, and it's due by the start of class on Monday. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you then.